So if that is okay, we are going to start recording now. Great, so welcome everyone. Welcome to today's training, Utilizing Bystander Intervention Techniques to Prevent and Address Gender-Based Violence. We are so glad that you joined us today. And this is the 6th training in a series of virtual training offerings made possible by Voices Against Violence, the Gender-Based Violence Global Initiative, which we call VAV for short. And VAV is a public-private partnership led by Vital Voices and funded with support from the State Department and the Avon Foundation for Women. Programming under VAV is designed to ensure that victims and survivors of gender-based violence and harmful practices around the world have better access to services, protection, and the justice they deserve. Today, we are thrilled to have Kirthi Jayakumar join us to provide the training. Kirthi is an activist, artist, entrepreneur, and writer from Chennai, India. She's also a Vital Voices Network woman leader, having participated in 2 VV fellowship programs, VV Lead and VV Engage. Kirthi is the recipient of the US Presidential Services Medal in 2012 from President Barack Obama for her services as a volunteer for the Delta Women NGO. She's the 3-time recipient of the UN Online Volunteer of the Year Award, and coincidentally, she actually spoke at a virtual UN General Assembly event earlier this week. Kirthi founded and runs the Gender Security Project, which works on feminist foreign policy, the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, and transitional justice with a focus on the Global South. She built a mobile app and AI-based tool called Saahas, which supports survivors of gender-based violence across 196 countries. So needless to say, Kirthi is a rock star, and we're thrilled to have her with us today to provide this training session. And right before I hand it to Kirthi, I'm going to quickly ask Mickey to please launch a pre-training poll question that we have for you. And after we get some responses from you, we're going to have Kirthi get us started.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, and thank you so much, BB family. I have to say it's family for having me here. So before I get into today's conversation, I just wanted to share with you that in the course of speaking about bystander intervention strategies, I will be mentioning gender-based violence and sharing a few examples of instances of gender-based violence. While I will take care not to be graphic, I also want to be mindful that even the mention can be triggering for some of us. So I've placed a link in the chat, which is a healing tool. It has a bunch of resources that you can use to ground yourself whenever you feel uncomfortable, triggered, or disoriented. Please prioritize self-care and please be mindful of what works best for you. So if stepping away from the screen is what you need to do, that's perfectly okay. If you want to jump back into the session, what you could do is to leave a message to either Jennifer or Mickey, letting them know that you're stepping away so that they'll know to share with you on chat when my share of a triggering kind is over. This is just to make sure that you are safe and that nothing going forward continues to trigger you when you jump back into the conversation. All right, so on that note, I am just going to take a quick second and share my screen. All right, can I have a thumbs up from anybody who can tell me if they can see my screen? You should be able to see a PDF. Awesome, thank you, Jennifer. Great, so we're going to be speaking about bystander intervention today, which is perhaps one of the things that we think we know enough about, but we don't really feel like we're equipped to address and respond to when the situation arises. So I want to also share with you where I'm coming from in the work that I do and what I'm informed by in terms of values for bystander intervention. So I created an app called Saahas, which is a feminist and peace tech tool that supports survivors of gender-based violence and also fosters active bystander intervention. So the strategies that I will be presenting before you and sharing with you today are strategies that have actually worked on ground. So every one of the ideas I'm going to share with you will be backed by examples and shares as well. And we're also going to try to see if you can apply some of these learnings to simulated scenarios in the course of breakout rooms, as Jennifer explained. So before we get into the conversation itself, a little note on the tools that we're going to be using. So we're going to use 3 different platforms for this conversation. Zoom, of course, which is where all of you are, but the chat function is open. So if you feel the need to pop me a question or share anything, even privately, you're welcome to do that. If you want me to read it out without sharing your name, you're welcome to share it with me privately. If you don't want me to read it out, you're also welcome to leave that as a note. We're also going to be using a tool called Jamboard and a separate tool called Mentimeter. I'm going to also pop a link to Jamboard over here in the course of our conversation. If anything comes up that you feel like you want to share, but you don't want to put your name to it, you're welcome to use Jamboard. What Jamboard will allow you to do is to pretty much place a sticky note, and that sticky note will not have your name on it. You can just drop in a comment on the sticky note that you choose and leave it for me to see. So if you're already on Jamboard, a quick note, on the left-hand side, you'll find yourself with a, you know what, let me just show that to you in a screen share. Here we are. So you should be able to see the Jamboard on the screen. Jennifer, I'm looking at you for a thumbs up. Awesome, thank you. So on the left over here, you see a cursor, a list of cursors present, and the fourth one on the list on the left is what lets you type in with a sticky note. So if I clicked sticky note, this is what pops up for me, and I say what I want, I pick a color, and I go ahead and hit save, and the sticky note is present on the background. Now, once you place it here, you can increase the size, you can reduce the size, you can move it about, you can click on the three dots and shoot delete. So we're going to come back to what the first slide says, but the second slide is really your safe sandbox. So if something comes up, if a question comes up, if you want to share something, if you think what I'm sharing is not ideal and you want to correct me, please use the safe sandbox to leave your comments. I'm very happy to dip into it every now and then, and we'll unpack some of the stuff that comes in without anyone's names being mentioned. We're also going to be using another tool called Mentimeter, but we'll get to that in a bit. We don't have to look at that right away. That's just to get your answers and to get maybe like a poll going when we need to discuss a few questions. All right. So what are we going to be talking about today? We're going to be looking at the basics of bystander intervention. We're going to look at a couple of questions and unpack the factors that prevent us or encourage us to intervene. We're also going to look at a concept called the theory of planned behavior, which helps you look at ways in which you can normalize intervention rather than watching from the sidelines or being a passive bystander. We're going to look at 4 key methods of intervention, which have been tried and tested on ground, and how you go about navigating a situation. How do you pick what's best? How do you figure out what other solutions could work in a given situation? And then we're going to go into looking at how we can prepare to intervene ahead of actually getting into the situation. And finally, get into a bunch of case studies and scenarios that we're going to unpack together in the course of our breakout rooms. So to start you off, I'm going to ask you to leave for me a few of your answers. So what I want you to do now is to open up a browser tab and go to the link I've placed on chat. Now, this is Mentimeter, the tool I was talking to you about. And I just want you to keep this open to dip in whenever we need to get into this. Great. So let's start with the first point. What is bystander intervention? And I'd love to get a sense of what you think or what you know of bystander intervention. You're welcome to unmute and share. You're welcome to leave a note on Jamboard if you see in the first slide. You're also welcome to leave me a message on chat. What do we understand of bystander intervention? Would anybody like to unmute and share? This would just help us understand where we're all coming from. I don't see an answer. Great. Okay, so I see Christina shared on chat. When you believe something is wrong and step in to help resolve or alleviate the situation. Brilliant. That was so beautifully put. Would anybody else like to share? I'm just going to take one quick answer before I move ahead. And no pressure if you would rather not. Okay, I'm going to assume that's a no, but if you do have an answer that you want to share, you're welcome to leave it on chat or on Jamboard. In Jamboard, I see a powerful answer already waiting for me, which is safely intervening in potentially dangerous situations as an outsider or a bystander. And another answer which says to me, it's a situation where someone who isn't directly involved steps in to change the outcome. Brilliant. These are perfect answers in so many ways. Now, to put that down to what we're talking about today, which is in the context of gender-based violence, everything that was shared actually ties in. So a bystander intervention is fundamentally where an individual or a group of individuals who are not connected with the incident directly, in the sense that they're not causing it or they're not facing it in the sense that they're not the target, but they directly take steps to intervene to change the outcome. Now, who would fit into the ideal of a bystander? It could be any individual. It could be you and me on a street. It could be a bunch of people who don't know each other coming together to form a group, or it could be a bunch of folks that are maybe colleagues at a workplace or friends out for a trip or just hanging out, whatever it may be. But typically involves people who want to change the outcome of what they see as potentially likely to escalate into a state of danger. Now, why does bystander intervention matter? In several instances, it is the one final frontier between a situation of harm and an escalated manifestation of that situation. So it plays a very significant role in intervening at the right time, in preventing a crime from taking place, in preventing the escalation of an already existing crime, and helps access the survivor or the person being targeted in ways that can get them out of the situation or make help available to them. So what I'd like you to do at this moment is to step into Mentimeter, where we're going to look at a question that I have in mind. What motivates us to intervene? I already see a few answers coming in, but let's see what the others have to share. What motivates us to intervene in a situation? See, we have empathy, compassion, concern, fear. Empathy and compassion seem to be on the big draw. A lot of people seem to be driven by these motivations to intervene. Concern, fear, of course. What else could possibly motivate us to intervene? Anger, that's an interesting thought. Thank you so much for sharing that. Let's wait for a couple more answers. I see 6 people have responded. So if the others could just use the link on chat, it will take you directly to Mentimeter and you can just enter your answers. Justice, it's the right thing to do. Beautiful. Discomfort, it's very interesting. So I see what could potentially be considered negative emotions of anger and discomfort being fabulous motivators. It's very interesting. Morality, I think it's similar to it is the right thing to do. Safety, very interesting. All right, need to do something, because I also see an answer on chat which says justice. Brilliant. It could escalate, absolutely. And the golden rule, humanity, kindness, camaraderie. Excellent. So I think we do have a fair bit of alignment with the answers we have here. Most often, we intervene based on the nexus we have to the incident that's happening or the person facing the incident. So what you see on the screen before you in my slide is what I call the continuum. Now, the key motivating factor for intervention, or that encourages us to intervene itself, is our stakeholding and the extent of care that's involved. So on the extreme left, you see a column that says you. Now, when it's something that you want to intervene into, which concerns you yourself, or immediately after you in the next column, an individual, somebody that you care for, your ability doesn't matter. You will intervene even if you're not powerful enough to get into the situation, because it concerns you. It concerns a person you have a close relationship with. But when you go towards the right, when you see the community and society, it involves people who you don't really know. So your first thought would be, am I capable of intervening? Do I have the ability to intervene in this situation? Does my intervention make sense here? You won't think that if it's for yourself or for a person you have a deep relationship with. In the same sense, interest. You are interested, you have a care and a deep degree of vested concern when it comes to yourself, your own interests, or the interests of a person who you have a close relationship with. But that interest kind of peters down into moderate levels with the community level and then the society after that. In the same sense, fear for the other. You care for yourself, you care for a person you have a relationship with. You do care for your community and your society, but only just a lesser degree in comparison to yourself or to people you care for. Expectations to intervene are high when it comes to yourself. If not you, who, when you have to safeguard your own interests? If not you, who, when you have to safeguard the interests of people you deeply care for? But again, not so much when it comes to the community and society, because in your mind, you're thinking somebody else will get to it. I don't have to be the first one to start this off. In the same sense, we look at themes of priority playing out in the same way. And the repercussions of not intervening are severe when it comes to ourselves and those that we care for, because the damage is immediately on us to face. But when it's community, when it is society, if we can put a distance between ourselves and what's happening outside of ourselves, then our stakeholding is relatively low. So across the continuum, what you see is a tapering down of interests. Now, in a hypothetical, in a conversation like this, in an answer on Mentimeter, we're motivated to say that it is the right thing to do. We're motivated to say that it is morality and justice and the golden rule and several such factors that drive us to do this, to intervene. But when a situation really does manifest before us, we do find ourselves thinking, and it's human, it's perfectly human. It doesn't make a person bad for thinking deeper about whether intervening or not intervening is the best way to go. So when you look at this in the form of a socio-ecological model, you find what I just shared with you mapped in a more comprehensible fashion. So when it's intervening for the individual or intervening for a person with whom the individual has a relation, one often looks at their attitudes, their beliefs, their interests and motivations, and see if any of the things that align with these areas are challenged by an incident happening that make it necessary to intervene. When it's your relationship, you're motivated by your association with the other person, your care for the other person, the love you share with the other person, sometimes even a bond of emotional or physical dependence, or just an attachment. A colleague is somebody you see every day, so you're attached to the person, even if there aren't any personal feelings involved. When it comes to the community, you tend to intervene when you find that there is a bond of cultural dependence. I, for one, know that I would intervene without a thought if another woman was being attacked, because I share that sense of community with women around the world. And I know that that form of an incident can be threatening to me tomorrow if I don't intervene to prevent it from happening to someone around me. There's a certain amount of community buy-in. There's a significant amount of dependency and coexistence when you're part of a community. And you also have shared values and a certain sense of a larger reprisal coming at you if one member of your community is targeted. But when it is society, you see that the values become more macro. Socio-political values in alignment with that. Themes of empathy, themes of compassion, themes of humanitarianism, and a sense of accountability. Now, these themes come into play when you look at the broader picture, when you look at the bigger picture, rather, the golden rule, the morality standard, the idea of what's right to do, and what feels like part of your engagement with that society itself. So as you go out in the circle, the concentric circles, if you look at them in that sense, you're more likely to intervene when your own interests are threatened. So let's go back to Mentimeter here and try to unpack a different way of looking at this. Why don't we intervene? What prevents us from intervening in a situation? Pretty much like the last time, what I'd like for you to do is to head to Mentimeter, check out the slide and enter your answers. What prevents us from intervening in a situation? Fear. Wow, that's huge. Uncertainty, discomfort. Right. Not knowing how, thinking someone else will, not my responsibility. Embarrassment, fear of overstepping. Uncertainty, lack of confidence, inability, concern for safety. All right, great. Thank you so much for sharing those answers. I'm going to just wait for a couple more seconds to see if there are any more before I head back. It looks like there's a significant alignment in the views here. So I'm seeing fear, embarrassment, thinking somebody else will, and the idea of not my responsibility. All right, thank you so much. Please keep those answers coming. I'm going to just jump back into my presentation to take this forward, but I am checking in with your answers as well. So what stood out for me loud and clear in this share here was that one of the biggest factors that prevents us from intervening is also rooted in what we assume bystander intervention is. We assume that it's about us putting ourselves into a situation and causing for a direct engagement to take place from our side to prevent the outcome from manifesting. But the good news is there are several ways to actually intervene without physically inserting yourself into the situation. So issues like fear, concerns about safety, concerns about embarrassment, concerns about not knowing what to do when you're in the middle of the situation, all of these can actually fall away a bit. And so we're going to unpack some of that through the 4 strategies that we will be looking at. But I also want to share with you some of the interesting findings that we found. So I did a needs assessment with several different groups to understand, pretty much like we did right now, where we're all coming from when we choose not to intervene in a situation. Broadly, as you see, a lot of these answers do align with the ones that we saw in Mentimeter. We saw fear, we saw a sense of feeling unsafe, about not wanting to get involved, even a sense of shirking. Now, that really just was one word to fit a huge answer into a circle, but just about not wanting to take the responsibility. Sometimes there was apathy, where people just felt like this isn't my problem. For some folks, it left them feeling triggered. Now, all of this creates what is called the bystander effect. Sometimes, even if we feel fear, even if we feel unsafe, even if we feel a sense of apathy or are triggered, one thought that's running in our mind is, if somebody else gets into this, maybe I will. And so what you do have is what's called the bystander effect, where everybody is waiting and watching, thinking somebody else is going to take the first step, and nobody takes that first step, right? Now, the problem with this is that the issue continues to find an enabling environment. It continues to escalate. It continues to grow larger and larger in ways that then become unmitigable. Some of the other responses we also saw is a person might feel caught off guard. I mean, they may have all the knowledge, they may have all the preparations and the skills, but they may just feel like they're put on the spot at that point. Some felt frozen. Some just felt that they, at that moment, did not have the means to intervene because of other circumstances drawing their attention. And a very interesting response that stood out for us was Sweet Brown's auto-tune song, Ain't Nobody Got Time for That. It was very interesting for us to see that, which basically speaks to how we tend to assume that there's only one way of intervention. And I really want to affirm that there isn't. It's going to be several ways that we're going to explore that together. All right, so now heading forward, we're going to talk about when we intervene in a situation. Now, one of the common misconceptions about bystander intervention is that we intervene when something is escalated before us. So we're thinking of 2 people fighting. When I use the word bystander intervention, and I've tried this out in a class of 5th graders, and they say to me, it means that when he and he are fighting, we're going to get in and we're going to split them up. And it almost invariably meant he. So we often tie the idea of how violence manifests before us as perpetrated exclusively by a male, perhaps in a fight of an equal nature with another male, or perhaps in a situation of an unequal power dynamic of a person of a different identity. Now, these scenarios are not very far from the truth in many situations. It's also somehow a conditioning that's made us understand that this is the only way and situation or time we're going to intervene. But what we're going to look at is called the continuum of behaviors. Now, bystander intervention in situations that happen before us also means that we're inserting ourselves into a situation that doesn't just happen overnight. It doesn't happen over a matter of a couple of seconds. It is a situation that is unfolding, that's developing, and that is slowly escalating into some form of violence. So on the extreme left, what I'd like for you to do is to go with me on the continuum from left to right. On the extreme left, when you see healthy, age-appropriate, if that's the community you're dealing with, mutually respectful and safe behaviors, that's something you don't have to worry about. And you can tell very easily when it's mutual, when you see that both parties are engaged or all parties involved are equally involved without anybody feeling uncomfortable. Now you go into one step further where you see there's mutually flirtatious and playful behavior, but it is still a step away from healthy and age-appropriate behavior. Now, this is not coming from a tone policing or a moral policing angle, but just because that there's a very thin line between consensual flirtatious behavior and non-consensual conduct. And that can easily be tread within a matter of seconds, which is why it is one step further than healthy and age-appropriate behavior. Now, going further, you see when something is inappropriate, either in terms of age or in terms of the power dynamic, or is simply non-mutual. And there are ways to tell this: a grimace in the face, moving away, trying to ask or change the topic, looking uncomfortable, trying to displace oneself from the situation, or just basically looking like they're not participating in this equally. And then we move into another escalated form of this, which is harassment. And then you have outright sexually abusive and violent behavior. Now, very often, we see in very rare cases an escalation from point box 1 to point box 4, and then still rarely to point box 5. So without really going through all of the stages. So the key to identify the right point to intervene is to be vigilant. Now, this is, of course, a cultivated skill. How observant can you be? What are all the things you're perceiving around you? How do you know the people? How well do you know the people you're hanging out with? How well do you know the strangers in the room that you're part of? How much can you read into the signs? Now, the continuum of behaviors asks for you to tap into what human behavior manifests as. How would you feel in a situation that makes you uncomfortable? And how is that going to manifest for you? So can you look at those signs manifesting in another person in your presence? Can you try to identify ways for those signs to be detected early on for you to respond? So the ideal point to intervene is not the flashpoint. You don't wait for the flashpoint to arrive. You don't wait for that escalation of violence or for the show of violence. You really start looking into the situation when it begins to look uncomfortable to you. At what point is it becoming non-consensual? At what point is it making one person in that engagement uncomfortable? And it's okay to err on the side of caution, because there are ways, like you see later on in the conversation, there are ways to intervene without really inserting yourself into the situation, to break up a potentially violent situation or a possibly escalable kind of a situation before it becomes dangerous. So the theory of planned behavior helps you do exactly that. Bystander intervention is not just about a workshop you attend. It's about a behavior that you cultivate. And we're going to look at ways to actually do that. But what the theory of planned behavior asks you to do is to normalize within yourself that you will address the intention as a bystander who will actively intervene. You will specifically invest and cultivate in the normalization of intervention, not the normalization of apathy or fear or discomfort or a sense of somebody else is going to start first. So how do you do that? You cultivate attitudes and beliefs that oppose sexual and gender-based violence. You know that it's simply not acceptable. And you know that it starts from a place where it's non-consensual. So when you cultivate the normalization of nonviolence, where you acknowledge the fact that gender-based and sexual violence are not okay, you begin to shift towards observing behaviors that align with acceptable thresholds, and non-acceptable thresholds then set off alarms in your mind. You also begin to perceive that the social norm is to intervene. Like we talked about earlier, it isn't about somebody else getting into the situation. Now, one of the things that I get asked a lot at this point is, we don't want to get involved in something that we don't have the emotional bandwidth to carry forward later. For instance, intervening in a situation may also mean that you might need to give evidence at some point in the future, that you might be asked to show up maybe in court or in the police station. But the good part is, again, this is something that comes up only in one manner of intervention, only in one kind of intervention. There are ways to get yourself off the situation, but still make a difference in the outcome without having to put yourself front and center if these are the dynamics that make you uncomfortable. And finally, the theory of planned behavior also means that you're constantly learning, you're constantly acquiring the skills you need to intervene, the resources, the tools, the community, and the behavioral patterns that you need to shift, starting with a shift in mindset to be able to intervene. So what it does then is to normalize the ideology that communities need to be safer, that it's our behaviors that can go towards making communities safer, not a new law, not a new police station, not a different scheme from the government, but it is us as people that can actually make that happen. So moving forward, we're going to get into the juicy part of the conversation. But before I get into that, I wanted to check in to see if we have any questions, any thoughts, any unpacking. I'm really happy to respond to anything that comes up at this point. I'm also going to step into Jamboard to see if we have anything there. So far, so good. So do we have any questions? Would anybody like to leave that in chat or unmute and share? It's perfectly fine. This isn't to mean that you can't ask questions later or leave questions on chat. Please feel free and encouraged to do that at any time in the conversation. I wouldn't want to put anyone on the spot, but this just felt like a good break to have at this point. So I'm going to assume there are no questions. I'm probably going to ask Jennifer and Nikki to let me know if there are any questions on chat so I can stop and get into that. Right, so now we're going to get into the actual part. How do we intervene? The first strategy that I found super useful is to distract. It simply is exactly as it means, to create a distraction that is enough for a perpetrator to discontinue whatever they're doing that is abusive, wrong, or violent. Now, what could this look like? This could look like spilling a drink, asking for directions, calling the victim aside as though you were asking what the targeted person really if they're not already targeted, calling them aside as if you're giving them a task, using your authority in that position. For instance, even crying out loud as though you were being threatened or you're in danger. So in 2019, in March, I did this workshop with a bunch of teenagers, students in grades 9 and 10. And we went through the entire set of learnings, and I was very certain that absolutely none of them would have retained it because teenagers, who does that? But by the end of a week, I had an email from one of the young men in the class, and he was about 12 or 13 years of age. And so just a little bit of background for those of you who are not familiar with the Indian education system. Most students finish with school roughly around the afternoon, 3 to 4 p.m. And then they go for extra supplementary lessons in the form of private tuitions. So this young man was doing just that. He finished with school, he headed to his private tuition, and he was on his bike getting back home, and he lived in a gated community. So as he's riding into the gated community's compound on his bike, he sees a 16-year-old boy who was also a resident in the apartment, fairly well built, really dragging a kindergartner by the collar of his shirt. Now, it's important at this point to know that the 13-year-old I'm speaking about was very thin, athletic, but very, very thin. And so what he sensed was wrong, what he knew was going wrong at that moment was not something he could break up physically. He couldn't get into that situation. It would mean that the 16-year-old of a heavier build would turn on him as well. And that would mean two people would be harmed, not just the child who was already potentially being harmed. So what this boy did was to very quietly bike into the compound without making a noise. He got off his bike gently and pushed his bike on the ground rather loudly, making sure to ring the bell as he did it. And he screamed, saying that his foot was hurt, and began crying loudly. Now, in that minute, literally in that minute, his screams brought people running in from all directions. There were folks who came in from the first and the ground floor. There were folks who came in from outside the gate. And in that split second of all these people rushing in, the 16-year-old boy was distracted. And with that moment, the young kindergartner found a way to escape and managed to get away from the clutches of the 16-year-old, get back home, find the courage to tell his parents what was happening, which actually turned out to be a series of events, one more which would have happened had it not been for this 13-year-old's intervention. Today, the 13-year-old, who is now 15, has not been discovered by the 16-year-old for what he did. It was a very simple strategy. It did not place him in the line of fire, but it disrupted a potentially dangerous situation. Folks have used this in several ways, even during the lockdown. In a gated community that we worked with, again, following this workshop, a group of women decided that they would help each other out. And they built a strategy on a WhatsApp group and deleted the WhatsApp group immediately after identifying their strategy. And it looked something like this. If one of the women in their houses was going through abusive situations, all they had to do was to tie a piece of cloth outside a designated window in each of their houses. Now, every hour, each woman in different houses would look out their balconies to see if a piece of cloth had been tied. And they noticed one piece of cloth had been tied in the house on the first floor. And so what they did was, one of the women used a megaphone and began shouting out COVID adversary, started saying things like, you must wash your hands every time you come in contact with someone outside. You have to use hand sanitizer. So she started screaming this out loud. And in that fraction of a second, it disrupted that potentially abusive situation. And the woman who was facing that violence was able to get away and slowly build into getting help that she needed to get out of that abusive situation later. But what situations like, what distraction does for situations like this is really to change that power dynamic by taking the attention of the perpetrator away from carrying that act of violence. The origin is innocuous. the person creating the distraction is literally screaming out COVID instructions in adversity or crying in pain after knocking off a bicycle. But it's just so simple that it doesn't get noticed as an act of intervention. So all you need to be able to do to disrupt a situation through distraction is really just to get into the mindset of doing something innocuous that will change the dynamic there, but not make you look like an intervener. So that's distraction. The second strategy I have for you here is delegation. Now, there are several situations and times when we feel like we can't insert ourselves in a circumstance, in a violent situation. We can't insert ourselves into disrupt it. It's challenging, it's scary, it's frightening. We saw all of those reasons. What delegation offers you then is the space to become a conduit between the person witnessing, as a person witnessing the incident, and a person who has the authority to intervene because of a power dynamic. And this could look something as basic as calling on a bouncer if you're in a place that has a bouncer, calling on a security guard, calling on the police. If you're with maybe a bunch of friends, the host of the party who can actually get a person who's being violent off the premises. Within the workspaces, reaching out to a senior staffer, reaching out to somebody who's in charge of operations on a daily basis. It just lets you shift the conversation a bit by bringing in somebody who has greater power over the perpetrator in that given situation. Now, delegation worked really beautifully again with the lockdown. Now, this is going to be a bit more descriptive of an incident of violence. So I would just like to bring to mind the trigger warning. Please feel free to let Jennifer or Mickey know that you want to step away, and they'll be sure to tell you once this example is over. So giving you a moment to do that before I go on. All right, thank you for your cooperation. It's just that I want to be trauma informed about this. We all come from different backgrounds. We've had different days, but at different points in the day, also dealing with our own triggers in so many ways. So I just want to make sure that nobody is inconvenienced. I hope this window has given you time to share with the both of them that you want to step away. I do see a chat from David. Yes, David, absolutely. You will receive a copy of this PowerPoint and a bunch of other resources. And a link to places that you can stay engaged with Saahas and its work for future updates around this as well. All right, so I think that gave people enough time if they wanted to step away, so I'm going to go right back into the conversation here. So delegation worked really beautifully during the lockdown. So there was this one family where the constant problem they faced was an abusive patriarch who used sexual violence against his daughters and his wife to pretty much show power. So on one occasion, things got really bad and became extremely dangerous and challenging for the three women in the house. And it seemed like one of them might have lost her life had the situation continued without being put to an end. So what happened at this point was the oldest sibling in the family was being targeted by her father, who began molesting her early in the morning and began to demand a sexual favor from his own daughter. Now, the younger daughter realized that she had absolutely enough of this. There was no way she was going to be willing to put up with this anymore, but she was really scared because her father had pushed her the last time she intervened and she wound up injuring her jaw. Now, she didn't want that to happen again. So what she decided to do was to slip out of the house very, very quietly and walked down to the end of the street on which her house was located. And she found over there, so in the city that she was in, and this is in India, so in the city that she was in, civic workers were positioned at the end of every street to make sure that people were not breaking curfew, were still staying indoors and observing all the rules for the pandemic prevention program. So this girl found a civic worker and said to her that there was a very dangerous situation unfolding and that she couldn't explain, but she needed them to come in at that moment and diffuse the situation somehow. So they gave her a head start. They realized that this was dangerous, and so they followed her and they went up into the house, but this time very cleverly, and they had tremendous presence of mind to not become agents of saviorhood, but really just do their job. So they rang the doorbell of the household where this girl had already slipped in very quietly and made it appear like they were doing a mandatory COVID temperature check from each household to see if anybody in the household showed symptoms, if anybody in the household needed isolation or quarantine or had to be taken away for any special support. So they spent a good 15 to 20 minutes asking every member inside that family alone. So they spent 15, 20 minutes with the mother, they spent 15 to 20 minutes with the older sibling who was being targeted, with the abusive father as well. And in that span of close to an hour, this young woman had managed to get in touch with a helpline, which she couldn't do because her father was breathing down her neck the entire time. And by the time the civic worker was finished with interviewing her about potential COVID symptoms or possibly having issues to complain about with the disease, the helpline had already dispatched workers to their house and took the three of them and rescued them. Now, on any ordinary day before that incident happened, ever since the lockdowns began, this would have been impossible. The act of making a phone call would have been impossible. And it was definitely an act of, a stroke of luck that the girl was able to slip away and get out. But it was sheer presence of mind and understanding that somebody bigger than her in terms of the power dynamic could get into the situation to create an enabling environment for her to get away. So with this, I have completed the example. Jennifer or Mickey, if you want to leave a chat message for anyone who's stepped aside so they know they can come back in. But what I want to share here is that delegation works beautifully if you can build into the theory of planned behavior, which means you plan ahead. You know for a fact that these are the routes that you're following. These are the places you go to. These are the places you're going to go to for the first time. So you scope the place a bit. You try to figure out who is available in these places. You try to understand who has or holds power in these places that you can reach out to delegate. So we're going to look a little bit at that further down, but broadly, this is something to think about when you're contemplating delegation. The next strategy, oops, here we go. The next strategy is direct intervention. Now, as you say, direct intervention really works if you are the person in a position of power, if you are the person who has what it takes to really disrupt that situation and tilt the balance against the person facing violence. Now, this is one of the most riskiest ways to intervene because it goes back to all of the factors we discussed earlier about why we shouldn't intervene or why we feel like we shouldn't intervene. So intervening directly really starts from a place where you feel absolutely certain that you can intervene, that you have the means to intervene, that you have the skills, the ability, the emotional, physical, infrastructural, and logistical bandwidth to intervene. And then you get into it knowing full well how you're going to intervene. So you see, it's a lot more trickier than distraction and delegation, but it is not impossible. So one of the ways to intervene directly is when you look at the continuum that we talked about earlier, where you saw the continuum of behaviors, when you know that something feels unpleasant, you could intervene directly and draw the person out to find out if what they're facing is okay, is something they can manage, or if it's something they want help in. You could drop them a text message if they seem like they're checking their phone, or you could signal to them to let them know, or to wave to you, or to just show some sign where they would need your help. I would say direct intervention is perhaps my last resort. It is something I have actually never used because I'm also chicken like that in most occasions. But it's just that really you want to prioritize what the outcome should be like. You want to prioritize breaking the potentiality of violence, and you also want to prevent maybe escalating that situation or creating a reprisal for the person for whom you intervene. So that's strategy number 3. Because I haven't really used it, I can't give you examples, but I'm sure you might have a rough idea of what direct intervention might look like. I'm happy to discuss that if you have any questions around what that could entail. Please feel free to leave that in here or on Jamboard. So moving to the last strategy, delayed intervention. Now, delayed intervention is perhaps understated, oftentimes ignored, and even considered not intervention by several, but the truth is that it supports a survivor's agency, an exercise of that agency to be able to get all the help and resources they need after an incident of violence. So a delayed intervention is exactly that. You intervene after the incident has happened. Now, oftentimes it's likely that the incident has happened in an environment where you couldn't notice it, but the person who faced it has come to you with a problem and says to you that they face this and they need help. So your intervention at that point could be anything from finding resources, giving them helpline numbers, just holding space and allowing them to share as much as they want, and even just making resources accessible to them, perhaps like a place to stay if they feel vulnerable another time in the future, or just directing them to the professionals that they may want to seek help from. Delayed intervention is perhaps one of the most useful methods when the kind of violence that takes place is not something that happens in the public eye or necessarily within the presence of another person. So internet-based violence, violence that happens inside the home, workplace violence that happens perhaps in a workplace digital space, which we see a huge upsurge of now that everybody's working from home. So the useful thing to do to respond in a delayed intervention setting is to just prepare ahead, to know the kind of resources you can make available, to list out maybe hospitals that are around your vicinity, emergency contact numbers, to identify shelter houses or people who can provide these resources. Now, delayed intervention truly has been the lifeblood of the work that I've done through Saahas, my app, because a lot of times women who've faced violence, and the majority has been women, most other people being individuals from the non-binary spectrum, but mostly people tend to go through several incidents of abuse, face several incidents of violence before they engage in help-seeking behavior. A part of help-seeking itself is really coming to terms with the fact that you've faced violence and you want to do something about it because it's no longer tolerable. Not that it ever was, but then you do reach a point, especially if you're facing this, and leaving is not an option immediately. So in the post context, one thing that I've found really useful is to be an empathetic listener. Many a time, people who are facing some forms of violence need a space to really think through, and a space that works like a container to hold their thoughts while they think through what their options are. And sometimes may need information to really understand what their options are. Now, you could be that expert if you're willing to maybe self-study or engage in personal learning or build up resources of your own to arrive at a place where you can offer advice, or you could be the conduit connecting them to professionals who can provide that kind of advice. Depending on the context and based on what the survivor wants. So I'm going to pause here. We have all the 4 strategies present on screen, and I want to see if anybody has any questions, any shares, perhaps if you've engaged in any forms of intervention before. I would love to hear what your thoughts are. And I see that the safe sandbox is still empty, which is okay, I think. Doesn't mean that there aren't things that are coming up, right? Any questions, any thoughts? Do you all really like the sound of my voice so much that you can just let it go on? Well, okay then. I'm going to take that as a yes and a compliment. So I'm going to go ahead, but like I said, please keep the questions coming on chat or on Jamboard. You're also welcome to send me a question privately if you feel uncomfortable about putting it out there with your name.
There are a couple on Jamboard, Kirthi.
Okay, great. That was super quick. Should I maybe refresh Jamboard? Oh, why, thank you, Internet. Okay, awesome. So I see a question that says, what do you do when someone reaches out but doesn't want to help? Okay, that's a really important question and also something to think about. We're going to look at this more deeply in one of the sections that comes in after, but a useful thing to do is to build a community of helpers. So if someone was to reach out to me and I physically am not able, so for instance, there was a point during the lockdown when I had COVID and somebody reached out to me and I simply physically couldn't do anything about it because I wasn't feeling well. So what I did was just say to them that this is not the right time for me to get into the situation because I am not in a condition to, but here are all these people I trust who have helped me and other survivors out in different contexts and situations. Feel free to use my name and reach out to them. Now, a good thing to do is when you know that you're not in a position to help another person is to check into the community first to see that they are able to also respond and then engage with them and pass on the information to them as well. So what I also see is, oh, I'm sorry, I think I misunderstood your question. Sorry. What do you do when someone reaches out but doesn't want help and doesn't leave, keeps going back to an abuser or is gaslighted? This is really tricky. One of the things to remember here is that a person who is facing violence doesn't lose their agency because they're facing violence. They still get to decide and get to decide how they want to proceed with their life. And leaving isn't as linear a decision for a person to make when they're part of the situation. So what you can keep doing is to stay as a supportive ally. What you can keep doing is to make them aware that you're a safe space and make them aware that help will be available when and if they feel is right for them to reach out. And that's about it. It's a very difficult place to navigate. It hurts to see a loved one or a friend or an acquaintance even going through a situation like this, but it is what it is. And you can't really override another person's agency. So I see a question on the blue sticky note which says, do you use GBV examples when you're teaching children, or what kind of examples you use with them when you teach them the 4 Ds of bystander intervention? Sure. So when I work with children, I do not use GBV examples. I've just been very mindful of the fact that the folks on this call are people who do work with GBV in some context. So I'm aware of the fact that these examples are more relevant. What I do with children is to use short stories. And if you're in India, there's a fabulous publisher called Tulika Books, which has a beautiful set of short stories in illustrated color books. I think they're also available as ebooks. I'm not very sure. So you might have to check out on that, but I'll make sure to include that in the packet of resources I send over to Jennifer to pass on to all of you. But broadly, I try to keep the examples specific to them through storytelling. I do not use triggering examples. Yeah. So my next question is, what do you do when someone reaches out to vent, but the survivor doesn't want? Okay, did I answer that already? I think I did. Okay. Do I see any other questions? So far, I think these are the only questions I see. Jennifer, am I missing any? I'm sorry, but like with screen share, my video on my internet could be acting up.
No, that's it. I'll let you know if there are other questions.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that. So I'm going to dive right back into the presentation, which is how do we prepare to be a bystander? So we've learned the strategies. We've also understood the mindsets we each individually have. And then we kind of can put both of these together to identify the strategies we can possibly deploy in a given situation. So how do we go about preparing to be a bystander? Now, at this point, I'm also going to touch upon some of the things that we can do as individuals, which may seem like information you already know, but when you put it in together in a packaged form to sort of look at it as part of your bystander intervention strategy, as your cultivated behavior to be an active bystander, you'll see reason in looking at this in a wholesome way. So the first thing is to start with your mindset. To intervene or not to intervene is really just, first of all, a mental decision to make. Am I going to get into this situation? Is that a yes enthusiastically? Is that a yes reluctantly? Is that a downright no? And can we unpack these things to understand how we want to be able to show up while we're still facing these triggers? So a good way to go is to start by working on yourself. Is a situation likely to trigger you? Do you tend to freeze? What are some of the fears you need to work on to be able to get to a point where you can comfortably use one or the other strategy to intervene? Do you feel challenged by the act of intervening itself? Now, if your answers to all of these are yes, it doesn't mean that you're incapable of intervention. It just means that you're going to pick a strategy that fits into all of these. It just means that you could be a delegator. It just means that you could be a disruptor or a distractor, but you don't have to get into the situation directly. So one of the useful things to do, and I find this really helpful, is to unpack my triggers almost on a daily or a weekly basis, because what triggers us is also as dynamic as how we respond to it. So a good way to do it is to just dip into your mindset, where you are personally at any given time, and take a check on how you feel. Physically, a lot of people have come back to report that taking up a self-defense training or building up on physical fitness and really helped them, particularly when they feel disposed to take up maybe a direct intervention in a given situation. I really found this to be true of many young people who feel very strongly about taking up self-defense training. Some of the more useful responses that I've had is just to know 1 or 2 really important self-defense moves is more than enough as training as well. But this is intensely personal. It's not something everybody has to do. It's a strategy that's worked for some people. Having useful first aid training as a background, building your speed and agility to just kind of respond to a situation immediately, and working on your mobility. How quick are you to move? And some of the more easier ways of really doing this is to keep grounding yourself. So if you dipped into the resources I shared in the beginning, the Healing Corner, you'll find there are a couple of resources that help you ground yourself when you're triggered. A good way to also just build your internal immunity, and I feel like that term is used a lot now with COVID, but what I'm trying to say is immunity to being triggered, is really to just center on what makes you physically strong to be able to take on a situation when you feel you need to get into it. Socially, this is a very helpful point if you want to intervene in the distraction or in the delegation form. Building a sense of community with people around you. So you've had this training today, you've had this conversation with me today. You're going to get the slides in a couple of days. How about if you take this training forward? Or if you feel underconfident, how about you divert more people to take on this training? So you build a community. You have a bunch of people who are aligned with you in mindset, who know and accept that violence cannot happen. And therefore there needs to be a community practice in place to intervene when such a situation takes place. And when one of you is not available, you still have the option of a backup. A second thing is to build a good resource pool. Figure out where you are. What is the landscape around you? What's the closest emergency shelter? What's the crisis response number or helpline number in your city? What's the closest hospital? What are some of the lawyers that you know have done really good work to support survivors? And what are maybe some of the ways in which a survivor could seek economic and educational support after facing an incident, so that leaving a place could also be a helpful decision to make? So one of the ways to cultivate this is to start with constantly really mapping out your space. Think about it, figure out all the resource pools that you need in your place. Continue to educate yourself, train yourself over and over again. This is just one conversation, but you have it more and more number of times. It becomes like something you know so familiarly, like it's the back of your hand. And constantly pay forward. Keep having this conversation with more people so that you get more folks on board with you in terms of their mindset. Logistics, very, very basic nuts and bolts of intervention really come down to where you are and what you have on your person. So having a good phone with you with a reasonable phone, which has enough battery charge, enough money if you're in a prepaid connection, and is capable of also weathering different kinds of contexts and situations if it needs to deal with data issues, so that you can make that one key phone call when it's most necessary. Having your emergency helpline information is extremely vital. One of the things I do when I travel anywhere in the world, even before I check out the hotels or even the sightseeing spaces, is to figure out what emergency support is available. Now, this is, of course, possibly likely to be interpreted as alarmist behavior, but I also find that I could be supportive of another person if I'm caught unawares. It isn't just about me. So it's also useful to figure out the route information. So if you're somebody who commutes on a daily basis to the workplace, then you probably want to scope out the entire route. You want to figure out what's available on your route to and back. What's the nearest hospital that you can run into in each street that you're part of? Or what's the closest police station? What stores are open at what time? What stores close at what time? How late into the night is a street well lit? And these things also help you plan out your logistical and topographical use of space if you want to intervene or if you want to get away from a situation yourself. And it's always helpful to carry a first aid kit so that you can make sure to provide that support, say if you were doing a delayed intervention with somebody who was injured. Carry cash, keep your cards, keep your loose change, but all within an accessible fashion so that if it ever comes to it, you do know where to find it immediately to be able to act. Some of the tools that you can also invest in is plain paper and pen. You can't underestimate that. It's important to have your numbers mapped. Of course, having it on your phone is great, but what if your phone isn't on your person or is just dying on you because its battery is run out or its monetary charges run out? So it's a good idea to have a bunch of numbers mapped out on a sheet of paper that you can access. Place them on your speed dial if it helps. Check out the apps that are available in your vicinity. Most of the world's countries have apps in some form or the other that makes emergency access possible. It needn't directly be specific to one geography or one issue. It could just carry helpline numbers. So make sure to invest in that as well. And I can't stress on this enough, a whistle or a noisemaker. It's one of the most efficient ways to disrupt a situation. You just need to blow a whistle and do so innocuously and disrupt a situation as well. So I'm going to pause here and going to check in if we have any questions.
There was one question, Kirthi, on the last slide, and it said, why would you want cash or card? So I was wondering if you could delve into that a little bit more.
Definitely. Thank you so much for drawing my attention there. So I'm coming from a very specific experience here in India, which still has public payphones, which still has stores that will let you use their phone if you bought something from them. And most often credit cards don't work there. So cash has always been very helpful, number one. The card has also worked very, very helpfully in situations where people had to admit someone in a hospital to get first aid. And some of these hospitals expect you to pay upfront, maybe for the immediate medical charges. So you want to carry that on your person. I've usually found that to be really helpful when you're in a situation of direct intervention. It also just helps you get away from a place if you were relying on public transport, if you were facing violence, to have some kind of cash or card on your person to book yourself out of that space at the soonest, even if that meant booking a cab and getting into it and leaving the space. So I hope that answered your question. So please keep your questions coming. What I'm going to do now is to turn it over to Jennifer and Mickey to divide us up into breakout rooms. So I see we have 16 participants, am I right there? And so what I'd like for you to do is when you get the invitation to join the breakout room, please get into it, and I will join you in each of your breakout rooms and give you a scenario that I want you to discuss using the strategies we've just talked about. And one thing to do would be to identify a person who would report out of each group, and then to come together to map your ideas. And then we'll have all of you come back to us in, can we give them 10 minutes so that everybody gets a fair chance to share and map their points? So we get a chance to come back and we'll share before we close the conversation. Okay. With the group that got this case study, I think it was breakout room 3. Would anybody in the group like to unmute and share?
I got nominated to share. My name is Pyle. I work at Vital Voices on our economic empowerment and entrepreneurship team. We talked about a distraction method in this scenario that would work best. Walking back home, if you're not sure if you're the only person, and it's just about to get physical, you may not want to put yourself in harm's way directly intervening, but some sort of distraction by yourself, or even, trying to get, if there's someone else nearby, to, make a loud noise, or, pretend that you're arguing with someone so that they get distracted and kind of diffuse the situation a little bit, would help. And so we talked about that, potentially seeing, maybe even delegate if we see that there are more people nearby. It really depends on the scenario. But if we're, in this case, if walking back home and that's a couple, the only people on the street we see is a couple, we thought that distraction would work best.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that, Pyle, and the other folks on breakout room 3. I think that's a really valuable insight, which is to see what the space is like if they're the only people, and then make a decision whether to delegate or distract. Would anybody else like to respond to what Pyle shared? If you agree, you could just leave a message on chat. If you disagree, then you're welcome to unmute and share in interest of time. Give that a moment to see where we stand. Okay, I agree. That's very nice to hear. All right, okay, so I see a couple of agrees coming in. If there is a disagree, please leave me a message. We'll get to you towards the end after everyone else shares. All right, moving to the next case. I think this was breakout room number 1 that got this case. Would anybody from the group like to unmute and share?
Hi, everyone. My name is Anand. I work for the Human Rights Team at Vital Voices. And for this scenario, we said that we will be there for the person. The first thing to do is to have an open conversation with that person and be compassionate and empathetic listener, and as well as giving them directive, or also giving them option to move forward.
Yeah, that's a really valuable insight there. I think it's also a bit tricky because you can't typically know what the text messages are saying, and you probably want to also navigate the space where you give them their space and you also want to be there for them. I think that's a really great response that you shared. Would anybody else like to respond to that? It's okay if you agree, if you disagree, or if you have something to add, would like to hear that. Okay, I'm going to take that as no answer so far. As always, please feel free to leave me a message. I can happily get back to that after all the others. Okay, I think this went to breakout room 2. I'd love to see if anyone can unmute and share.
I think I was in breakout room 2. It was about the friend who was drunk and a man wanted your drunk friend to go home with him and how you would intervene in that situation. I think that I would go with the direct approach or the delegation approach. Like for delegation, who's the host? We talked about whether you would want to involve a female friend or a male friend because a male friend might make the other man feel threatened and want to prove his manliness, but a female friend he might not take as seriously. But if you were to be direct, you would go up and say something like, oh, she's going home with me, or oh, she has a boyfriend. But if it's really serious, there's options that could be distract. The only one I could think of for distract was like to pull the fire alarm, which is very extreme, but it is an option.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that, Katie, and folks in breakout room 2. One of the things that this scenario has brought up across different demographics is that planning ahead can help figure out the best way to go for this. When you know that you're a group of people that are heading out somewhere and you know that you're going to be drinking, or some of you are going to be drinking, you also know that a situation may arise where you don't have the active freedom to consent. So setting a pattern beforehand, figuring out, like Katie beautifully shared, which friend would intervene based on what the circumstance is, and what would that intervention really look like? What would that help-seeking behavior look like? Let's assume she hadn't gotten really drunk, but he's forcing her to drink, and she wants for one of her friends to know what was happening. So maybe building, like we talked about earlier, the theory of planned behavior and the sense of community, just kind of building a way to approach that well in advance will also help you plan and implement it on ground when a situation arises. So that was a perfectly valuable answer, and just wanted to add this to that. Any thoughts from anybody? Agreeing, disagreeing, additional responses or strategies that you will use?
We're in the same group, so I think I agree with Katie.
Yeah. Thank you, Carmelita. Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you.
All right. I'm gonna go ahead.
One thing to add. I think this is a little tough because I do have friends in this scenario who can consent when they're drunk and they don't mind, I'm all for, safe and consensual and casual, whatever they want to do. And so I've gotten to the point where it's like, okay, well, what's that level of sobriety like? And so I always ask like a series of questions to like make sure that they're like sober enough to like make that decision on their own, versus, that they're too far gone to like, give that consent. So this one's a little tricky because I have been in situations where they're like, no, I'm like really fine and I do want to, do this. So yeah, it's a little tough to assess.
Yeah, I've been in that situation too, a fair number of times, where a friend is wanting to go with someone or in that situation and not able to consent. But like we discussed that in the group. And I think a strategy would be to like discuss with friends beforehand, like, okay, if I'm drunk and I'm even saying that I would be willing to go, because I know that I would never, ever, ever be willing to go with anyone. But if I'm drunk, I mean, I can't actually imagine myself wanting to go, even if I'm drunk, because that's something that's really not something I can imagine myself doing. But if you establish beforehand, like, I make bad decisions when drunk, please prevent me from going with a stranger. Yeah. Like, that's another way to go. Because I've been out with friends that are friends and then their friends are acquaintances. And I'm like, I don't know you well enough to make that choice. But my choice and my values would say, no, don't ever go with a stranger. And so should I follow my values or, what they're saying while drunk? And like, when it comes to consent, consenting while drunk is not consent. But like, I also want to respect my friend's decisions. But like, if he's going to, do anything with her in a sexual value,
while she's drunk, that's not her giving her consent. I mean, that's what they discuss in like university campuses and things like that. So I don't know, you know.
Yeah, well, thank you both for sharing that, because I think, like you both said, it is a very tricky situation to navigate when you're doing the navigation yourself. But having that conversation beforehand, like Kirthi said, just understanding what each one's threshold is. And then, like Payal said, coming up with those questions to put them on the spot to really figure out if that's where they are, and then actioning it. One useful thing to bear in mind is just to err on the side of caution. You know, if you know that what seems like consent to you is not necessarily tying into the behavior, you see a big disconnect between the two, then just err on the side of caution. That would be, you know, you'd rather do that than put them in the line of fire, if you will. All right, moving to the last scenario. I think this went to breakout room 4, was it?
We didn't delegate, but I can just jump in and share.
Sure.
So we thought about this. It's first, I mean, we would just listen carefully and try and assess, like, what can we tell from what's going on. There was a mention that COVID, there's a lot of house parties. You don't know necessarily, but trying to understand maybe a little bit better how urgent or serious the situation is. And then we kind of went through like all of the different Ds, like what we would do with that situation. So like, depending on how urgent it was, whether we would try to distract or delegate or just check in the next day if it, I mean, it seems bad, but like it didn't seem, if it resolved, I guess, quickly. And distract, we also thought maybe either create your own noise. If it's super urgent, also we discussed pulling the fire alarm, knocking on the door, you know, maybe even if that means running away, just like distracting for a bit. Delegating if it's an apartment building or a gated, you know, gated community, going to on-site security rather than police might be able to get someone on site much more quickly than police, or of course going to the police if that seems like it's necessary, or, you know, the best course of action. And if they are potentially trustworthy, depending on where you are. And then, yeah, the last option is delay. If it's bad, but then it kind of seems to resolve, like just checking in the next day, making up an excuse to go around and, you know, just trust building and signaling that there's concern.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think this situation, obviously context will inform more, but the situation lends itself to many methods that seem appropriate given what you have at the moment. If there's somebody to delegate to, if there's a community of practice among all folks involved in the building, in the apartment, if everybody is on the same page with a bystander intervention strategy, then you probably want to go ahead and implement that. Brilliant. Well, would anybody else like to respond to this, or does anyone else have anything to share in line with this? Okay, I'm going to take that as a no, but of course, you can always leave me a message on chat. I'm happy to unpack that with you. But that brings me to the end of my presentation. I hope it's been useful for you. I hope it's given you something to think about. One of the things I find myself thinking about every time is that a lot of this information is stuff we already know, but somehow just putting it together and seeing it within the frames of a given context may hopefully be helpful to each of us from wherever we are. So thank you so much for listening. Thank you for giving me the space to share. And thank you for also sharing back with me. It was wonderful to learn from each of your thoughts and responses as well. So I'm going to give it back to Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Kirthi. This was such a wonderful training. I know that at least in my breakout room, we had a great conversation and the scenario was much appreciated because we were able to put the 4 Ds of bystander intervention into action. Thank you everyone who joined us. I've just dropped a survey link into the chat. If you could please take 2 minutes to fill out that survey, that would really, really help us. We will also be sending some follow-up materials via email, and we'll reshare that survey link so that you could please take that. It is really short. It'll only take a couple of minutes. Again, thank you so much to Kirthi. This session was recorded, so we can share that as well. And Kirthi, as she mentioned, has some resources we'll be sending over. So thanks to everyone for joining. We hope to see you at our next training. We'll keep you updated on that. And hopefully you all have a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks very much, everyone.